Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here virtually on this format. The support for these programs are brought to you by the Nancy-Carroll Draper Charitable Foundation, as well as Sage Creek Ranch, which help make everything that we do possible. We're also grateful to you, our audience, for the support of these programs and for your feedback along the way for programs like the Lunchtime Expedition program. We are recording these lectures. And they will be available later this day or by the end of this week on our Draper YouTube channel. So if you just go to youtube.com, search Draper Natural History Museum, look for that bear icon, you will find all of our lectures from this year, all of our recorded lectures from this year, as well as the previous couple of years. So if you've missed any of our speakers, please go check there and you will be able to access those presentations. If you'd like to be added to our email list for upcoming programs and presentations, there will be an email posted on the bottom of our closeout slide, so stay tuned for that. We've also started including links to our previous presentations in these emails, so that's another good reason to sign up. We are broadcasting today's presentation over Zoom webinar with a feed to Facebook Live, so feel free at any time to submit your questions for our speaker today in the Zoom's Q&A feature. If you hover your mouse over the presentation in Zoom, you will see an icon pop up that has Q&A and a couple of comment bubbles. If you click on that, you'll be able to submit questions to the speaker, and we will relay them to Dr. Jacobson at the end of the presentation. Also on Facebook Live, you can enter your questions there, and we are actively monitoring that as well, so we can relay those questions as well. So whichever format, please feel free to send in your questions at any time as they come up. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Andrew Jacobson. Jacobson is the Assistant Professor of GIS and Conservation in the Department of Environment and Sustainability at Catawba College in Salisbury, North Carolina. Jacobson attended the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University, where he earned his master's degree and began a specialization in GIS. He furthered this expertise by obtaining his PhD from the Geography Department at the University of College London, where his doctoral research focused on the distribution of large carnivores on human-dominated landscapes of East Africa. Jacobson is a conservation biologist who leverages geographic information systems, also known as GIS, and remote sensing to research the location and distribution of special species and places on planet Earth. He has worked as a science and geospatial advisor to the National Geographic Society, helping to identify and prioritize protection of wild places throughout the world. Effective species conservation begins with acquiring and analyzing high-quality data. GIS and remote sensing are very powerful tools in the hands of those who know how to leverage them. As we'll learn in today's presentation, careful evaluation and analysis of these data can prompt changes in national and international policy for threatened and at-risk species, which enhance the efforts to stabilize and hopefully recover these populations. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Andrew Jacobson.
All right. So thank you, Corey, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Draper Natural History Museum for inviting me here today. It's my pleasure to be here talking to everyone about my work. Obviously, the format isn't ideal here, doing this virtually. I'd love to be there in person and meeting and talking with each one of you kind of individually. So, unfortunately, we're not able to do that. So I'll have to speak to an empty room and the internet, and just have to deal with that, the realities of today. But thank you so much again for the offer to do this. I'm really excited to kind of be here virtually and share with you and your members about my work and my research. So before I begin, and actually Corey kind of gave a great introduction to the talk. I almost feel like I'm gonna have to skip some slides here. Catawba College is located here in central North Carolina. We're a private liberal arts school, about 1,100, 1,200 students. Located just an hour or so away from Charlotte. All right, so I'm going to start the lecture or start our discussion. It'll last about half an hour, by the way. And feel free to interrupt me if you have questions, or you can save them for the end, either way. So today I want to talk to you about field research in lions and GIS and remote sensing and all that stuff. All right, so I'm going to start with a story that you may probably are familiar with, and that's the man-eater lions of Tsavo. Right, back in 1898, 2 lions terrorized railway workers attempting to build a railway from Nairobi, Kenya to the coast in Mombasa. And they were killed anywhere from 35 up to 135 people before they were shot and killed by Lieutenant Colonel John Patterson. And now this event, this exceptional event, has been kind of captured the public's interest and attention, and was, featured in films. Val Kilmer, the Ghost in the Darkness. Obviously this is a very exceptional event, an unusual event, but studying wildlife, particularly carnivores, is dangerous work. And so we wanted to kind of start with that. And so in some ways, if I can study how they're doing and study and know more about them remotely, and stay out of harm's way, then maybe that's a good thing, right? But in all honesty, field work is absolutely essential biological field work is absolutely essential to do certain types of research. And you kind of have to put yourself in harm's way in some situations, right? But it's expensive. It's complicated by staffing issues, permitting issues. It can be lonesome, long months out kind of by yourself in the field. You also kind of need to be this MacGyver mechanic, 4x4 driver and scientist all rolled into one. If your truck breaks an axle while you're out, or you get stuck in the mud, you've got to figure your own way out of there before the lions can get you, right? If you're trying to do this in Africa or something. And so that it takes a special kind of person to be able to do that, and to do that effectively and safely. And that's certainly what perhaps got me into this originally, and that's what I kind of dreamed about growing up. But now I'm kind of a family man. I got 2 young children, and I don't have the time to be able to kind of go out and do this type of field work anymore. And so but I still want to be able to affect conservation for species like the lion. And so I can do that kind of through this alternative methods of GIS and remote sensing. And I'll just say kind of one more thing as a lead-in, which is biological field work is really essential. Being a good naturalist, field worker, it's really critical. But in some ways, it's limiting. You kind of are studying, maybe a pride of lions, or the lions within one national park. And if you want to ask certain types of questions, like what is the conservation status of an entire species, well, then you need to know what's going on beyond just a single pride of lions or a single park. You need to know what's going on across parks, across countries, and perhaps even across continents. And for that, to be able to scale up to that level of information, you really need to be able to go on just simply biological field work and move into kind of GIS and remote sensing. So what is GIS and remote sensing? Well, the good news is that you've already done it. So that's great, right? It may sound complex, but you're actually already doing this. I'm going to start by talking about remote sensing, because it's something you've probably already done today, in fact. We're most familiar with visual remote sensing, and that's simply kind of taking a photograph of something. We're capturing information about the reflectance of objects remotely. We're capturing information about the reflectance of our environment, of an object, without actually touching it, right? So let's take, for example, we take a photograph of this white box. Now, white is highly reflective, but we can we can understand, without actually touching the box, by just taking a photograph of it, we can understand things like its shape, its size, the angles it has, the length of the edges. If we had some sort of a reference size, like say hands in here, we could understand the volume that's captured in that box. We could uncover a lot of information about this object without actually ever having touched it, just by taking a photograph of it. Now, the visual remote sensing is kind of the most common way, but we're all probably somewhat familiar with this idea or concept of acoustic remote sensing as well, like using sonar. But we'll focus on the visual remote sensing part. And so primarily taking photographs of objects, we do this every day. Now, satellite remote sensing is simply taking photographs of the Earth from satellites to determine information about the surface of the Earth remotely. It's that same concept that I just described, but it's done by satellite, and they're covering vast swaths of the Earth 24/7. And these satellites don't just capture information in that visible range of the electromagnetic spectrum. So we're able to capture information in that visible range of the electromagnetic spectrum, and the kind of to determine things like the color, the reflectance that's given off by the surface of the Earth. And so we can determine if what we're looking at is water, or if it's a forest, what kind of forest. We can tell if it's coniferous or a deciduous forest, or if it's grasslands, or if it's glaciers, or anything like any of these types of different land covers have different reflectance values. And we can determine what they are based off this visual information we're gathering, we're capturing from the satellite. And that's just within the visible range of the electromagnetic spectrum. We can also capture information in the near infrared or the UV portions of the electromagnetic spectrum. And then we can look at even more information about Earth and vegetation than we could otherwise. And so then we can start to find things like, understand things like temperature of the Earth's surface, or the water temperature. We can look at the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. We can look at the presence of vegetation, of course, but also the health of it. Is it stressed by water, or is it undergoing water stress or disease? And we can do this with crops or with trees. We can do so many things by looking at capturing information like through these satellites, both within and the visible range and outside the visible range of that electromagnetic spectrum. So really, really cool, really powerful. And what's so amazing about these is that their satellites they're very highly repeatable. It's consistent. They're capturing images of the large portions of the Earth repeatedly over time. And so we're able then to start to do things like change detection. Well, was it a forest yesterday? Was it a forest 2 days ago? Is it still a forest today? And if it's not, then what happened? Was there a forest fire that came through and cleared it out, or was it destruction? Was it deforestation? And so we can accomplish and understand all of those types of things and behaviors just by this visual satellite remote sensing, which is really cool. Now, what about GIS? GIS is Geographic Information Systems, and it's kind of broken into kind of two parts, right? The first part you're probably more familiar with, and that's just kind of reference mapping, right? So that's just mapping the location of things and understanding where they are in relation to each other. Where's the closest grocery store? Where am I now? Where's the closest grocery store? Where's the entrance to Yellowstone National Park? Things like that. So we can determine proximity, distance, direction, and some of those spatial relationships just through this kind of reference mapping where things are, where they are in relation to other things. But where GIS is really powerful is going beyond that and mapping not just the locations of things, but mapping data. And so this could be mapping demographic or socioeconomic data. Where are populations of people? What types of people are they? What age groups? What socioeconomic classes are they? We can map other things about people like diseases, COVID-19. Where are cases of COVID-19 occurring? And are there geographic similarities or clusters that are occurring? And that's actually how GIS got its start, is through mapping. It's basically health mapping. Okay, so people have been doing map making forever. For a very long time, people have been making maps of things, location of where one thing is versus another. But then to try to use kind of that mapping information or data as opposed to just the location of things, that's kind of started here in 1854, or thought to have started in 1854, with a Dr. John Snow, who was mapping out cholera cases in London. And you can see the points in red are the locations where there are cases of cholera, and the size of that dot is the intensity or the size, the number of cases in that location, probably a household. And the blue locations are where there's a water spigot or a well. And the families had to all use similar or the same wells. They didn't have wells in their own house, water in their own house. So they had to go to these common points, and that's where cholera was shared. He was able to, by mapping these things out, he was able to find that cholera was actually transmitted through the water, and by people transmitted it at these kind of central or focal points. And so that was incredibly powerful, and basically started he started kind of two different fields or disciplines at the same time. Epidemiology is the study of the spread of disease, and GIS. And so there are obvious kind of tie-ins to mapping COVID and coronavirus today. Okay, so let's, as a little bit of a sidetrack, let's kind of return to this idea of GIS and mapping data and environmental data in particular. So what are some of the types of environmental data that we have available? Well, we've got information on land and air quality, vegetation type, vegetation presence and vegetation type, different land use or land cover types. Is it an urban area? Is it a suburban area, commercial? Or is it, waters, swampland, grassland, that type of thing? How many people are in a location? What's the density of people? Is it in one jurisdiction or one municipality or another? We can look at the land features, so the elevation or altitude of an area. Are you on a north-facing slope or south-facing slope? How rough or rugged is the terrain? We can determine all of those types of things through a digital elevation model. And then, of course, you'd be wanting to map the presence and location of water. And so we can capture all these types of geographic data sets that are these digital representations of reality. So we're attempting to recreate reality here within a digital format. And we've got all sorts of different types of data that we can use to do that. And so that's where kind of the power of GIS comes from. And one thing that you might notice that's not listed on here, and that the primary point of today's talk is about, is mapping the location and presence of species. So we want to know maybe the distribution of a species. Where is it found? Where is it not found? And the abundance or the density of the species. And so that's primarily the type of things that I do. Right? So if we care, now I'm transitioning into the work that I do. And so I'm presuming that we care about, we want to know, or we care about how well a species is doing. And so we want to be able to manage that species, like a lion or a grizzly bear. And if we don't have data on it, then how can we manage it? So how I initially got my start in this field was about a decade ago, and I want to share this little video with you. We started there's a project with National Geographic where we wanted to understand the distribution of the lion in Africa. And we were looking at various geographic data sets, and we were unsatisfied with the existing data that we had. And we wanted to know a simple question, basically, where are people? And so here you can see this high resolution data that's available very easily and readily on Google Earth. And so we started using Google Earth to do our own work. A group of students, master's students and undergraduate students, started drawing, digitizing on Google Earth the presence of croplands. Now this is kind of a crude drawing, but those kind of geometric shapes that are kind of lighter in color, I'm drawing red lines around those are croplands. And so we attempted to draw these shapes and capture where urban areas and croplands and people were in this landscape. And we wanted to do it across all of Africa, but that was impossible. With almost 20 or 30 students, taking almost 1,000 hours, we managed to do most of West and some of Central Africa, mapping human occupation and land uses in this manner. And so you can see here, all these areas in red are places where there's urban areas or croplands or fields. And so once we have that data, that we could then infer where lions may or may not be. We knew based off the ecology of the lion that they were probably not found in these red areas. Lions are pretty controversial, confrontational. They tend to get into trouble and people tend to kill them as soon as they wander into croplands or fields or urban areas. They're too confrontational. So we knew that lions were not going to be hanging out in these areas, but they might readily be within these large open spaces like this national park. So taking this type of information painstakingly, we were able to then kind of ascertain where lions may or may not be. And we were able to understand information about lion habitat. Okay, so that was kind of an introduction to the initial work that we started to do to understand the distribution of and the conservation status of the lion. So that type of information, this land use and land cover information, mapping where people are, falls here under this first kind of category of geographic data. So we pulled together all sorts of geographic data, primarily information on where people were and where other species are. We pulled together all this information, peer-reviewed literature or unpeer-reviewed gray literature. We're trying to compile all the information that we could on the lion. And then we wanted to map those or document those observations. Where were lions found? Where were they not found? And what level of abundance or density maybe were they? And so we were able to kind of pull these kind of three general types of information: geographic data, reports and literature, and presence and population data, and combine them into to make these new updated conservation assessments of a species. And we made new distribution maps and maps of their kind of abundance. And so this is the same general kind of approach that I've taken for three different big cats: the lion, the leopard, and the cheetah. And so you can see here the finished products for the same kind of general process that I just laid out, how we got to these new updated conservation assessments for some of the most iconic carnivores or species actually overall in the world. All right. So on the left, you can see their updated maps. In the center here, these are the peer-reviewed publications that came out as a result of this work. And obviously some cute cuddly pictures here on the right. So in these updated conservation assessments contained in these manuscripts, we assessed what was the extent of the historical range of the species, what was its current range, where was it found currently, and how much had that shrunk by. And then we wanted to give an estimate of the population, the remaining population size of that species. Okay, so that may have been good scientific work, good academic exercise, but how did that work actually translate into conservation work on the ground? How have I been able to kind of translate this type of work that I've done remotely with GIS and remote sensing from my safe confines in my office to making a difference for lions on the ground in Tanzania, in Africa. All right, so one of the ways that this has worked is that each of those three species and those three major publications have gone on to inform the IUCN Red List categorization of that species. And I'll explain what I mean by that a bit more. So the IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and they're primarily known for publishing this Red List of threatened species. And this is a categorization of species that attempts to rank all known species based off the level of threat of extinction that they face. And it ranges from, well, some species are not evaluated, or there's not enough data known about them to be able to evaluate them or assess them. But these categories range from least concern, so like the house sparrow or white-tailed deer, the animals that we know are doing fairly well. They're wide-ranging, they're abundant, they're not of concern, they're not a threat to go extinct. And so that's least concern, and then the species are ranked in these different categories up to endangered, critically endangered, or then extinct in the wild, or overall extinct, where the species is no longer found, even in zoos, right? So each of those three peer-reviewed manuscripts went to update the IUCN Red List status for each of those species. And in at least one case, with the case of the leopard, it actually changed that threat level. It changed from near threatened, and it was upgraded to vulnerable, meaning it was more threatened with extinction than it had been previously recognized. Okay, so what's the benefit here? Well, these greater levels of threat, vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered, if your species is listed with, is categorized with these listings, then you're more eligible to receive funding for conservation work. And so if you're listed as one of these categories, then you're eligible for more greater national or international funding opportunities. And so that's important. All right. There's also national level legislation that can work to inform or to work to conserve species, right? The most obvious example here in the US is the Endangered Species Act. Now, you probably know offhand that none of these cats live in the United States, right? None of them are native here. So each country in the world, most countries in the world have legislation that's similar to the US's Endangered Species Act, where they might list species, list how, categorize how threatened they are, prioritize species based off of threat, and then give them different, and then restrict activities on those species or to those species based off of that level of threat that they face. And I don't know exactly how all of the range countries where those species are found, how our reports may have updated or changed the species threat level in those own national pieces of legislation. So like within Tanzania, I don't know if they upgraded the leopard or the cheetah to a different threat level. So I don't know that. I haven't been able to follow that. But I do know what's been going on in the US. And importantly, the US Endangered Species Act classifies species or lists species that are threatened regardless of their location. So that means that both domestic and international species can be listed on the US Endangered Species Act. So they don't have to be found within our borders to be listed as threatened or endangered on the US Endangered Species Act. So that's important. And what it means is that if the species is listed on our Endangered Species Act as threatened or endangered, then the ESA can regulate activities that Americans do or conduct to ensure that Americans are not furthering the decline or contributing to the decline of the species. Right? And so you'll see how that kind of plays out with some species later in a slide or two. Okay. There's also international legislation that relates to the conservation of species. And the primary one that I'll talk about is called CITES. And this is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And so this international legislation lists species, or species can be petitioned to be listed on CITES based off of how threatened they are, as well as how threatened they are by international trade. So trade either in live specimens or in dead, or as dead. So it's trophy hunting, trophies, skins, paws, claws, teeth, all of those kind of parts or derivatives of a species that may be traded can be regulated here under CITES. So if a species is threatened with extinction, and the trade is impacting that, or may be impacting that, the decline of that species, then the species could be found on a petition to be listed on Appendix 1. If the species is threatened with trade, or there's a lot of kind of international trade in that species, but it's not, the species isn't terribly threatened with extinction, then it may be listed on Appendix 2. Okay, so basically all of the Felidae, all of the cats, including the 3 cats that I've worked on, are listed here on Appendix 1. They're threatened with extinction, and international trade could contribute to their decline. And so CITES specifically regulates the import and export of parts, the derivatives of either in whole or in part of these species. Yeah, so that's all I'll say about that. All right, so here we are again, kind of across these 3 different species that I've worked on. How are they doing in each in these different kind of categories and these different pieces of legislation? Well, all 3 of the cats are listed on the IUCN Red List as vulnerable. As I said, my work on the leopard helped cause it to be upgraded from near threatened category to the vulnerable category. All 3 of these cats are listed on CITES Appendix 1, meaning they have the most restrictive level of trade restrictions placed on them. Domestically, domestically under the Endangered Species Act, that's a more tricky situation. There's more variation here. The cheetah is the simplest case. The cheetah has been listed as endangered on our Endangered Species Act, wherever the cheetah is found since the beginning, since 1970. Now, both the leopard and the lion, their status was petitioned to be changed. Basically, an NGO or several NGOs petitioned to change the status of the lion and leopard to the federal government shortly after my publications came out. Our general publications came out about the status of the species. So in 2015, the lion was petitioned to be changed or upgraded from threatened to endangered on the US Endangered Species Act. It went through this whole kind of governmental process. It was somewhat controversial. And lions in Asia, North and West and Central Africa were decided to be listed as endangered in 2015, which basically meant that people could not hunt or kill them. Americans could not do that in those locations. Panthera leo melanochaeta, found in Eastern and Southern Africa, where the population is kind of where the lions are doing better. It was decided that it should remain at this threatened level or category. And that allows for the possibility or continuance of trophy hunting of lions from those populations in those areas. Now, the reality is that to be able to do trophy hunting and to bring the trophy, the lion, the dead lion, back with you from Africa back to the US, it had to be proven that the trophy hunting operation was done in such a way as to actually benefit the conservation of the species. And now this was actually a fairly high bar to clear. Many of you probably know that hunting can contribute to conservation in important ways. The trophy hunting operators kind of control territory, they manage game, and importantly in Africa, they control poachers, and so they conduct anti-poaching operations. And that can really contribute to the conservation of the species and provide economic returns for the species presence. However, that's actually pretty difficult to actually prove. And so very few cases have been made in which the trophy hunting operation has proved to the federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service, that it's contributing to the conservation. And so basically this listing has contributed to a massive decline in trophy hunting by Americans of lions in Africa. Okay, I can talk more about that later if you have questions. Similarly, kind of with leopards, they were a trophy hunted species. They still are. And a couple nonprofits petitioned to list or upgrade the listing of the leopard from threatened to endangered, based off of kind of the work that I'd done. This was petitioned in 2016, at which point the Fish and Wildlife Service found that the listing had standing, but then basically it's stalled. There's been no further progress on the listing, and basically that I think that the Fish and Wildlife Service will probably need to be sued in order for them to be able to kind of have to continue reviewing this petition to reclassify the leopards. So anyway, I can talk a little bit more about this stuff later if people are interested. But so that's kind of how the work that I've done has contributed to the legislation, both internationally and domestically, surrounding the conservation of these species. Okay, so in summary, kind of the conservation summary of the species, what has GIS and remote sensing kind of helped us figure out and understand? Well, the lion there are fewer than 30,000 individuals remaining in less than 20% of their historic range. Lions are declining rapidly across the range, except for portions of Southern Africa. They're found primarily in Eastern and Southern Africa here. And there is still a remaining population in Asia, found in kind of Western India and Gujarat, of 500 plus lions that are doing quite well. So that's kind of this, a quick update on the status of the lion. Now the leopard, there are fewer than 10,000 individuals across North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The species is highly fragmented across this range and declining pretty rapidly. Some are they're critically endangered. The exception kind of is in India, where there's still, leopards are still quite abundant. So that's kind of north of the Saharan Desert and all of the Asia. Now in sub-Saharan Africa, there's no credible population estimate. Nobody knows how many leopards are there or are remaining. It's thought that there at least there are probably more than 10,000 individuals, but we really don't know. They're still quite wide-ranging. Overall, the species has suffered range loss, likely of more than 60% of their historic range. Okay, now with cheetah, probably the gravest situation for any of these big cats. Cheetah are now found in less than 10% of their historic range, so that area in gray. And there are fewer than 7,100 individuals remaining. Cheetahs used to range across the Middle East and into Asia, and now there's only fewer than 50 individuals remaining, and they're restricted to Iran. And so this is a very, very tough situation, and they're declining rapidly there, and they need help. Cheetah are primarily found in Eastern and Southern Africa, and the population stronghold is definitely within Southern Africa here, this Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa down here. Okay, so that's kind of a quick update on the status of each of these species. So to bring it back, basically where is GIS headed and remote sensing, and can we kind of relate this back to what the beginning part of this talk and to folks in the Intermountain West. So GIS, as I said, kind of started with epidemiology and mapping disease, which is quite interesting related to today. But really, it kind of got it started to take off only in the 1960s with mapping natural resources, mining locations of minerals and natural resources, and governmental uses. Then it started to be uptake by utilities, oil and gas, forestry applications, moved into transportation applications in the 1980s, along with communication and defense. And so increasingly been adopted in other industries now in health, public safety, homeland security in the 2000s. So GIS has been widely adopted across disciplines, across industries, as it's become, as computers have become more powerful, and as data has become cheaper and easier to access. Now, how does this relate to back to the environment and to species that we care about? Well, GIS is critical to understand species movements and migration patterns and setting up conservation areas, knowing where species are, where they're remaining, how many there are, in order to, and trying to protect them. And one of the greatest kind of worldwide examples of this is right there in your kind of backyard. You guys probably all know about this, and that's the Yellowstone to Yukon kind of conservation corridor. A large corridor connecting core areas of habitat, of populations that stretch basically from just south of Yellowstone National Park all the way up to kind of Alaska and the Yukon, right? And so GIS is and remote sensing plays a fundamental role in the creation of this, right? We need to know what the underlying land use and land cover, topography and elevation are of these areas. We need to know where species are found or where they're not, in order to be able to implement this type of activity and to be able to protect them. And one of the coolest things I think that's where this type of work is going is through this program called ICARUS, and I'm gonna let it kind of talk about it. It's a short 2-minute video, and this is my last slide here. But I want to tell you a little bit more about how kind of this type of GIS remote sensing technology is changing and how it's relevant to things like the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative. And they really do mean literally now. So the just maybe within the last year, ICARUS was there was a spacewalk on the International Space Station, and the antenna was hooked up and is now operational, and it's going through testing phases right now. And here in the summer of 2020 is when there'll be more of a broad, wide-scale general public release where scientists from around the world can start to access and use this new resource. And so this is really revolutionary. So it will allow scientists to be able to put smaller, more lightweight, cheaper radio collars on more animals. And so basically you could put radio collars, satellite trackers on things like insects and birds. And you could understand how those species move, how those individuals move. And you're able to do this across much larger scales than you were able to do that before. And you're able to track an entire group of animals, an entire herd, for instance, or a population. And ICARUS is also going to enable people to understand the physiology and health of the species that they're tracking. So ICARUS is going to be really revolutionary and allow a much greater ability to track and monitor species health and movement and behavior in real time. And so that type of data and information can readily feed into understanding migration patterns, habitat corridors, and making initiatives like Yellowstone to the Yukon kind of even better. So I wanted to finish there. With that kind of note of we're headed into a really cool future where GIS, remote sensing, and big data on animals and animal movement should hopefully help us understand and address some of the great challenges we're facing today. With that, thank you to Corey and Nathan. Thank you to the Buffalo Bill Center for the West, and happy to kind of take any questions that are available. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm gonna start the video here and try to swap this over. So you've kind of already touched on one of the questions I had, but I want to follow up while we give people a chance to submit questions. Again, you can submit your questions on the Facebook link there, the comment section below, or if you hover around your the Zoom feature, you will see either on the top or the bottom a Q&A there. Click on that and you can submit questions to Andrew there. So Andrew, one of the questions that you've kind of already hit on that I wanted to ask was, what do you see as the next wave of GIS and remote sensing applications? It looks like ICARUS is kind of taking that approach. So kind of as a follow-up to that, you know, is there anything else that you've either seen or heard, another way that people or organizations, groups are leveraging and using these tools outside of typical conservation applications that would be particularly useful for the research that you and your groups do?
Sure. So certainly the satellite remote sensing is developing really rapidly, and more satellites are going up in the air, and they're getting ever better at the resolution at which they're taking photographs of the Earth is getting finer and finer. And so we can now get information about, at the sub-meter level, as opposed to previously we could only get information at kind of a 1 kilometer scale level or something like that. So these satellites are able to derive information about the land cover or other factors, other environmental data on the surface of the Earth at ever finer scales and with greater resolution, both temporally and spatially. And so this is really kind of changing the game in the sense that we're awash in data, right? This is kind of the classic big data situation. And so I think what's really cool is matching up some of this big data with of monitoring the environment with some of the big data that we're getting from animal movements and behaviors, right? That was going to be available via ICARUS. And to be able to put those things together and be able to ask questions about, like, migration pathways and movements, understanding their health and physiology. And I think we'll be able to do that in ways that we never really expected, and in ways that that will be really powerful. But citizens can contribute to this type of information too. The big data from citizens is like citizen science projects. So things like iNaturalist. So uploading images of where you see a species, the time, date, how many you've seen, and thousands and thousands of people are doing this, creating millions of records of observations of species across the planet. And that type of big data is also being matched and fed into kind of the remote sensing data. And so we're able to tell so much more about kind of where species are and how they're doing than we were able to before. So I think there's a lot of, there's a neat convergence of things here that are allowing both citizens and scientists to know more and understand more about our environment and how animals are navigating that.
Yeah, we live in this time where information and data is almost instantaneously available, and so kind of another follow-up question to that I was thinking is some landscapes like in the rainforest in the Congo, the DRC, the Amazonian rainforest. They're undergoing these rapid and massive landscape changes due to deforestation or conversion of those landscapes for livestock or for agriculture. So does the rate and the scale at which some of these landscapes are altered, does that make using and keeping up with derived data layers challenging, or is that a benefit because you now have the information quicker? Is that on what side of the spectrum does that make someone who analyzes these large data sets more difficult or easier?
Easier, probably. And they're becoming, certainly we've talked about this with media in a sense, where we're trying to kind of, media information is coming at us through like a hose, right? It's hard to focus on a single story before the next one hits. That's, in a sense, that's kind of what's happening with some of this remote sensing and other data. We're getting so much data. We're needing to develop new applications and tools to be able to process it and to be able to analyze it and process it and view it and share it. And that stuff is happening. So things like Google Earth Engine is an incredibly useful application that pulls in all sorts of different data sets. A lot of them are from satellites, remote sensing data sets. And you're able to really use the power of cloud computing to analyze these massive data sets within a matter of minutes or hours. And they're incredibly powerful application to help us analyze really big data sets. And the stuff you can do is just people could hardly dream of just 10 years ago. And you can see an example of this kind of the power of this through a cool nonprofit and website called Global Forest Watch. And so if people are interested in this type of data, you can go to globalforestwatch.org, and they monitor the status of forests kind of throughout the world and in real time. And so they were some of the first ones to get a high resolution data on forest cover throughout the world. And they did that by using Google's cloud computing services. And now they're allowing people to kind of track deforestation in real time. You're able to, like, a researcher or a nonprofit can like circle an area in Bolivia or Brazil and say, I want to know about any time there's a change in forest in this area. I want to know about that immediately. And basically, since satellites are passing over this area on a daily basis, you can have kind of near real-time data to say that, look, there was forest here yesterday, but there's no forest here today. And it might send an automatic alert then to that researcher, to that nonprofit group, to say, hey, this pixel, this particular location has changed. Now, it could be natural. It could have been a flood or a windstorm could have knocked down some trees. But in many cases, it was deforestation. It could be illegal deforestation. And so that would allow people to dispatch troops or monitors to that location and try to stop deforestation as soon as it happens. So those are, it's a pretty cool application and use of this kind of real-time data that you're talking about in challenging, difficult situations.
Yeah, it's crazy impressive the speed at which information can make it into the hands of people.
Right.
So one kind of question following up on the work you've done with the large cats in Africa. So we kind of have a status update of as of 2020. What does that look like by 2100? What does the future look like for the lion, the leopard, and the cheetah over the next 80 to 100 years? Are these kind of core zones likely to persist? Is conservation and kind of development of these areas regionally and by country likely to continue sprawling outward and into these protected zones? Or is that kind of a smart growth mindset something that is likely to set in to maintain kind of these populations on the landscape?
That's a great question. And certainly the key question is what will that kind of population nadir, the bottommost point in the population trajectory, what will that look like? Will the species have gone extinct, or will it kind of go down to a few thousand individuals and then be able to recover? And that's what we need to try to figure out. And each of one of those three species kind of interacts with people in a different way, so it's hard to generalize. They're all large carnivores, but cheetah, for instance, live at pretty low densities, and they range across hundreds of square miles, hundreds of square kilometers. And so to adequately conserve species like the cheetah, they can't just be contained within national parks, even at the scale of Africa. And the African national parks can be 20,000 square kilometers in size, massive blocks of land. But to have a population a sustainable population of cheetahs, kind of from a genetic standpoint, you might need tens of thousands of square kilometers or hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, and you just can't protect all that land in the same way. And so the cheetah is going to need to protect the cheetah, we're going to need to work with private landowners. That's absolutely essential. And cheetah, thankfully, aren't quite as aggressive and confrontational as the lion. They don't kill people. So that should be possible. We should be able to protect the cheetah fairly well on landscapes that have people. And so they still may be some core areas within national parks, protected areas, but they should be able to subsist within human-dominated landscapes with some ranching or grazing activities. So the question there is, how well can we change opinions, behaviors, and habits to increase that cohabitation, the coexistence of cheetah with people. Now the lion is in kind of a different situation on a different side of the spectrum. They live in fairly high densities, up to 10 or 20 individuals per 100 up to 10 or 20 individuals per 100 square kilometers. So almost 100 times greater in some cases than the cheetah. So you can have large populations, several hundred individuals, several thousand individuals within a single national park, a big one, but within a single park, like Kruger National Park or Serengeti. So the lion, the question there is, are they going to be able to subsist at all in landscapes that are going to be human dominated, increasingly impacted by people? Or will they not be able to survive in those locations? I don't think any of these species are going to go extinct. The lion is not going to go extinct. It'll still reside within these core protected areas that will contain hundreds or thousands of lions. But it may shrink, the population may shrink dramatically down to these protected areas and basically not live anywhere outside of them. And that would be a really sad situation, but it may be what's necessary. And the population may decline down to 10 or 15,000 individuals or fewer. So the question there with the lion is kind of how well can we protect the species within the protected areas? We need to be able to do that with the utmost efficacy and first. That's our first priority, is protect the species within the protected areas. And then we can start thinking about protecting them outside of the protected areas, in those human-dominated landscapes, private lands, where they might need to, like that corridor kind of idea, Yellowstone to Yukon, like, so that the lion can go from one national park to another to maintain genetic flow. So the challenge is Africa is growing really rapidly. East Africa in particular has some of the highest population growth rates in the world. So yeah, they're going to be threatened. Populations and livestock populations are still going to be spreading out throughout these areas, and the species are going to continue to decline probably for the foreseeable future. But we need slightly different strategies for each one of those three cats. And I think I'm not terribly concerned that any of them will go extinct, but that doesn't mean we can relax. They definitely need attention and conservation attention and concern.
Yeah, we see a lot of parallels here as well. We have a large number of migratory ungulates, the pronghorn, the elk, the mule deer, and I think you hit the nail on the head with so much of it. There's the phrase, wildlife management is people management. The wildlife manage themselves, but it's getting all these different stakeholders together. The private landowners are a huge one. Different people with different interests, and finding that common goal, because ultimately so many of these different groups are after the same end goal, and that is access and availability of high quality landscapes, habitat, resources, you name it, label it whatever you want, but for the use and enjoyment of future generations. So how do you protect that landscape in such a way to make it multi-use, multifunctional, and still benefit those different stakeholder groups that want to use it? Right. So yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels there. Speaking of the kind of Yellowstone to Yukon thing, the text, the Terborg and Soule text, Continental Conservation. We recently lost Michael Soule. But like that kind of framework of how to re-envision the landscape for not only these kind of short-term goals, but ultimately, what's it going to look like for the next species that's, fine now, but threatened or endangered 10, 20, 30 years from now. That kind of bigger picture thinking and having these kinds of zoomed out views, like ICARUS is looking at, of like, what's global movement patterns looking like, I think helps us to contextualize the needs of the landscape. So.
Yeah, having kind of bigger goals is definitely kind of necessary right now.
Yeah. So the last question I have for you is, do you still close your eyes at night and then see polygons in your eyelids?
No, thankfully not. My days of hand digitizing croplands is over, hopefully. That was a painful chapter in my life.
Character building.
Sure. Yes.
Well, Andrew, I want to thank you, extend gratitude on behalf of the Center of the West and the Draper Natural History Museum for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with us and our virtual audience today. Hopefully we can get you out here in person in the future and hear additional updates on the ways that you're leveraging these emerging technologies to enhance and aid conservation efforts. So again, on behalf of all of us here, thank you for your time and your willingness to provide a virtual presentation.
My pleasure. It's great to be here. Well, virtually here. And thank you again for the invitation.
You got it. And to all of you watching online, thank you for spending your afternoon with us. We hope to see you soon.
Take care.
Take care.